So, as I previously said, the start point of the war between Ukraine and Russia was the beginning of the protests in Kyiv at the end of 2013, that you know as revolution in Ukraine or Euromaidan. The main idea of this protest: people want to get rid of the political system, which functional they were fed up with. I don't want to repeat the chronology of this period. I was there all the time and saw with my own eyes the situation. I can tell you about all processes. Was it planned with American or Russian influence? Every side could have its own benefits. But I can tell about ordinary activists who simply wanted to change the political system which ruled country into that perspective utopical side, back to the USSR. A vast amount of people wanted to come back to the Soviet past for different reasons, and that political system used that sympathizers as an electoral resource. I should say this polarization of people started from far 2004, the first Maidan or Orange Revolution, and it was in proportional near 50-50. The country was divided in political sympathy on the West and East, pro-European and pro-Russian. So, pro-Russian part supports the current ideology, activists promoted democratic European ideas. Everything inside the country was partitioned into two parts: journalists, TV, culture, sportsmen and simple habitants. Especially it was contrasted with the successful politics of pro-European former President Yushchenko. But that period needs a separate episode. At the beginning of the Euromaidan, it was a small bunch of people, political activists, journalists and simple students. But in course of time, this amount rising in every Ukrainian town and village. The Party of Regions also had their own protests, called Anti-Maidan, as a support to the current political system. And there we all know cases of man-made protests with payments, marginal members of these protests, buses of people from different towns, even from Russia, especially Donbas region, using state employees. It was a very contrasting picture, especially in contrast with pro-European side. I can't say that pro-European side was clean and clear. I didn't see, but can admit, money support from business people, especially those who didn't agree with that political situation. On Euromaidan, I had heard about some payments, buses from different towns, and maybe payments for some personalities. But also I saw a lot of middle-class businessmen helping or taking part in the protests. It was funny to observe those anti-Maidan people before the abduction of the activists and the first murders. Some personalities were ready to do everything for the money. The police blocked people in many ways. To be brief, simple habitants were fighting for self-freedom and rights, authorities saving power and influence, foreign sides spending money and effects on the results. As you remember, EU and US governments supported Maidan and Russia anti-Maidan. What about the West's influence? It's very difficult to see investments, besides information support. Russian propaganda was working in full power, and I want to admit it isn't stopping from that period any one day, especially now. More than half of the amount of the news is about how is it in Ukraine. Quite looks like a diversion from their own interior problems. Also, there were a lot of consultations between the Ukrainian and Russian governments on how to rule these protests. How was organized and managed shooting people last days? It's also a big question. So, after the shooting, Ukraine had a runaway president and middle functional parliament. By coincidence, Russia furtively entered their troops into Crimea without emblems. Suddenly, in many Donbas towns, grew up callings enter Russian troops in their towns, as mushrooms after the rain. Russian troops incognito entered through the Ukrainian border and in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Ukraine's temporary government mobilized the army and started defending. All this situation you may know as a Donbas part of the war. All this period Russian news was full of headlines. Ukraine kills Russian language people in Donbas, and so on. Ukraine, without government, a strong political system or ideology, tried to defeat their own inhabitants, willingly believed.